Imagine standing inside the Roman Colosseum, the largest amphitheater ever built, surrounded by the deafening roar of 50,000 spectators. The air is heavy with the smell of sweat, fear, and iron. Everyone knows this place as the arena of gladiators, the place where armored men fought to the death for the entertainment of Rome's elite. But that is only part of the story. The Colosseum was never just about heroic duels. It was a machine of terror, a stage designed to remind everyone watching what happened to those who defied Rome. What went on here was darker, crueler, and more calculated than most people imagine. The emperors didn't just punish criminals, they turned their deaths into theater. Each morning began not with gladiators, but with blood. Prisoners, slaves, and condemned enemies were dragged into the arena to be humiliated and killed in front of the cheering mob. Some were tied to stakes and burned alive. Others were stripped naked and left to be mauled by lions and leopards while the crowd roared in delight. This wasn't just punishment, it was spectacle designed to send a message. And as time went on, the audience demanded more. Simple executions no longer satisfied the Roman appetite for cruelty. They wanted something shocking, something creative, something they could talk about for days after. So the games became more elaborate. Condemned men were forced to act out scenes from Rome's most famous myths and die just as the characters in the stories had died. If the legend said someone was torn apart by wild animals, that is exactly what would happen. If it said they were burned, the arena became an inferno. The people watching weren't seeing an illusion. They were seeing real death disguised as entertainment. The emperors understood that this was more than a game. It was a reminder of Rome's power. The Colosseum was not just a place for entertainment, but a place where fear was cultivated, where the state showed its citizens and enemies alike exactly what it could do to a human body. Every scream that echoed through the arena was part of the performance. Every death was meant to shock, horrify, and impress. And this was only the beginning, because the most sadistic tortures were yet to come. The Romans were masters of turning death into theater, but their true genius lay in how they twisted punishment into psychological torture long before the killing blow was struck. The Colosseum wasn't just a place to die, it was a place to suffer first. Prisoners were often kept in holding cells beneath the arena for days, listening to the muffled screams of those who went before them. The walls dripped with condensation, and the air was foul with the stench of fear and decay. Some men went mad before they ever saw daylight again. The Romans knew that breaking a man's mind was just as entertaining as breaking his body. When the gates finally opened and the prisoners were led out, the spectacle began with deliberate cruelty. Some were forced to carry their own instruments of death, wooden crosses, iron chains, or even weapons that they would not be allowed to use. The crowd loved this humiliation. Every stumble, every tear, every desperate plea for mercy was a part of the show. Sometimes the condemned were dressed up in elaborate costumes to mock them. A thief might be dressed as Mercury, the messenger god, only to have his hands chopped off before being beaten to death. A murderer might be forced to play Orpheus, charming wild beasts with music, until the animals turned on him and tore him apart. The Romans took pleasure in matching punishment to crime in ways that were both ironic and sadistic. The cruelty didn't stop there. Some executions were designed to prolong the agony for as long as possible. Victims were tied to posts and scourged until their backs were flayed open, their screams echoing across the stone seats. Others were smeared with pitch or resin and set ablaze at night, their burning bodies illuminating the games like human torches. And then there were the wild beast hunts, the venaciones, which were far more horrifying than most people imagine. Animals were starved for days to make them more ferocious. Prisoners were thrown in unarmed, with no chance of survival. Some were dismembered by bears or lions while still alive, their agony lasting minutes before death came. Sometimes the animals themselves were killed slowly for sport, the arena floor soaked with the mingled blood of man and beast. The most disturbing part is that this was considered family entertainment. Children watched alongside their parents, cheering as men were disemboweled or burned. Senators, priests, and emperors sat in the imperial box, nodding in approval. For Rome, cruelty was not hidden away. It was celebrated in the open, a cornerstone of their identity as a people who ruled the world through fear. But the Romans also understood the value of surprise. The Colosseum was a place where the unexpected always happened. Sometimes a prisoner was spared at the last moment to heighten the drama. Sometimes the execution was delayed, just as the final blow was about to fall, sending the audience into a frenzy of anticipation. The crowd's emotions were manipulated like a musical instrument. Fear, pity, excitement, and joy all played in perfect harmony. And beneath all this spectacle, there was a darker truth. The Colosseum was not merely about justice or entertainment. It was a tool of control. Each public execution reminded the citizens of Rome that rebellion, crime, or defiance came at a price too terrible to contemplate. The games kept the people in line by showing them what happened to anyone who stood against the empire. Yet there were even more horrifying methods reserved for special occasions, deaths so slow and inventive that they entered the annals of legend. Those stories are what we'll dive into next, where the Colosseum transformed into a nightmare laboratory of human suffering. The further we look into the Colosseum's history, the clearer it becomes that the Romans were not merely executing criminals. They were staging spectacles of suffering that blurred the line between punishment and theater. Some of the most grotesque punishments were designed to evoke horror and fascination at the same time, making the audience complicit in the cruelty. One of the most nightmarish punishments involved sewing the condemned into the hides of freshly killed animals. This wasn't just to humiliate them, it was meant to attract wild beasts. Dogs, wolves, and big cats were drawn by the smell of blood, tearing at the skin and the screaming prisoner inside. The crowd roared with delight as the animals ripped and clawed, the man's body eventually shredded along with the hide. There was no quick death, only a slow, frenzied destruction. Another infamous execution style was the so-called damnatio ad bestias, the condemnation to the beasts. But sometimes this wasn't just a simple mauling. The Romans loved to stage elaborate reenactments of mythological stories where the prisoner became the tragic hero, doomed to die in a grisly parody of legend. A condemned man might be dressed as Hercules, forced to fight a lion with his bare hands, knowing he stood no chance. Or he might play the role of Icarus, strapped to a contraption that flew before being dropped to his death. One of the most disturbing was the reenactment of the myth of Dirce, where a woman was tied to a bull's horns and dragged violently around the arena until she was reduced to a lifeless heap. The crowd wasn't just watching a death, they were watching a story unfold with blood as the ink. There were also crucifixions, but not the kind most people imagine. In the Colosseum, they were theatrical, staged for maximum spectacle. Sometimes dozens or even hundreds of crosses were erected at once, forming a ghastly forest of suffering. Victims were arranged in patterns, sometimes spelling out messages to the crowd or forming grisly tableaux that matched the theme of the games. Death could take hours, even days, and the screams would become part of the ambience, echoing over the cheers of the audience. Perhaps most psychologically tormenting of all were the staged pardons, moments where the condemned were given hope, only to have it ripped away. A man might be spared after surviving a round with a wild beast, only to be killed minutes later by a gladiator's sword. This manipulation of life and death kept the crowd at the edge of their seats and left the condemned in a state of utter despair. It is also believed that some prisoners were made to fight each other in hopeless combat, with no training, no armor, and no chance to survive. It wasn't a fair fight like the gladiators had. This was raw slaughter. Sometimes they were armed with wooden weapons that would break easily, forcing them to face an armed opponent defenseless. The bloodbath that followed wasn't a tea entertainment in the way we think of a show today. It was a public ritual meant to remind everyone that Rome's power was absolute. Even the animals themselves were victims of this endless spectacle. Exotic creatures were brought from every corner of the empire. Elephants, giraffes, crocodiles, even rhinoceroses, not for preservation, but for killing. Some were made to fight each other, or were starved until they turned on the prisoners. Thousands of animals died in a single day of games, turning the sand into a red mire. All of this was done under the blazing Roman sun, the crowd chanting and cheering as if they were at a festival. Senators and aristocrats nodded approvingly, while slaves cleaned the arena between acts, spreading fresh sand to soak up the blood before the next horror began. And yet, what we've seen so far only scratches the surface. Because beyond the executions, Beyond the animals, beyond the bloodletting, there were tortures so rare and so ingenious that they became whispered legends, punishments designed to shock even the jaded Roman citizens who thought they had seen everything. Those are the punishments we'll explore next, the secret torments that made the Colosseum a place of nightmares, even for those who never set foot inside its gates. There were punishments in the Colosseum so cruel, so inventive, that even hardened Romans whispered about them afterward. These were not the regular executions the people expected. They were spectacles meant to shock the senses and remind everyone that the state's power was limitless. One of the most horrifying of these punishments involved boiling. Ancient writers tell us of copper cauldrons filled with water or oil, placed over roaring fires right there in the arena. The condemned were lowered slowly, screaming, their skin blistering and peeling before the crowd. Sometimes, to prolong the spectacle, they were dipped halfway and pulled out again, allowing the pain to continue without killing them too quickly. The audience would gasp, some turning away, but most stayed, morbidly fascinated, as the steam rose around the victim. Dismemberment was another form of slow death designed for maximum psychological impact. Victims were chained to platforms and had their limbs cut off one by one, or tied to chariots that pulled in opposite directions until the body tore apart. This gruesome act wasn't just about killing. It was about showing the crowd the fragility of the human body. The executioners were careful not to finish the job too quickly, pausing between each blow, giving the audience time to react. Then there were the games that played with the prisoners' minds before killing them. A condemned man might be told he would be freed if he could outrun a wild beast. The gate would open, and a lion or leopard would be released, the man given a few seconds' head start. The crowd erupted in cheers, urging him to run. For a brief moment, there was hope, until the inevitable happened. The animal always caught up. Some prisoners were even made to choose their method of death. A wild animal, the sword, or the cross. Most chose the beast, thinking it would be faster. It rarely was. The Colosseum also saw executions where prisoners were burned alive, not simply as a way to kill them, but as part of a theatrical performance. The condemned might be dressed as mythological figures associated with fire, like Prometheus, and chained to a stake as flames engulfed them. The Romans loved the symbolism. The man stole fire and now perished by it. Perhaps the most chilling were the staged rescues that never came. Prisoners would be tied to posts while wild beasts were released into the arena, but the animals had been starved for days. The victims watched them approach slowly, sniffing the air, waiting. Sometimes the animals were hesitant, and the executioners would prod them forward with hot irons until the mauling began. The crowd waited in suspense, the tension stretching on and on, until the sand ran red. Psychological torment was a weapon in itself. Some victims were made to watch the torture and death of others before their turn came, heightening their dread. Families might be executed together, forced to witness each other's deaths one by one. It was as much a show for the crowd as it was a lesson for the condemned. You were utterly powerless, and your suffering would serve as entertainment. The emperor's presence made these punishments even more terrifying. When the ruler himself was watching, there was no chance of mercy. A simple gesture, a nod, a raised hand, decided whether someone lived or died. Sometimes the emperor would deliberately delay the signal, letting the prisoner sweat under the gaze of tens of thousands before finally giving the fatal order. And always, when the spectacle ended, slaves entered the arena to clear the bodies, refill the sand and prepare for the next act. The audience would murmur and shift, their appetite for blood not yet satisfied. The games would continue until sunset, one death after another, until the arena was littered with carcasses of both man and beast. But even after the games ended, the memory lingered. Romans would talk about the most shocking deaths for days, gossiping about how bravely someone had faced the beasts, or how horrifically someone had screamed. These punishments were not just justice, they were cultural events, shared experiences that bound the citizens of Rome together in their fascination with death. And yet, perhaps the darkest truth of all is that many of these punishments were not for heinous crimes. Some were for petty theft, desertion, or simply angering the wrong official, which means countless victims of the Colosseum weren't just criminals. They were examples, warnings carved into flesh for all to see. One of the most unnerving aspects of the Colosseum wasn't just the physical brutality. It was the way the Romans used hope as a weapon. The condemned weren't always marched straight to their deaths. Sometimes they were given false promises, made to believe that survival was possible if they performed well, fought bravely, or entertained the crowd. A common trick was the staged pardon. The prisoner would be told that the emperor might spare his life if the people willed it. He would be brought into the arena, trembling, and forced to beg for mercy before tens of thousands of spectators. The crowd would cheer or jeer, creating a deafening noise that echoed off the stone. Sometimes the emperor would play along, holding up his hand as though considering the man's fate, drawing out the tension until the prisoner could barely breathe. Then, just when hope seemed real, the sentence would be carried out anyway. The beast released, the sword drawn. The hope had been nothing but part of the show. Some emperors took a cruel pleasure in this. Commodus, infamous for fighting as a gladiator himself, was said to toy with prisoners for sport, ordering them to be dressed in humiliating costumes before killing them personally with a spear. He would prolong the spectacle, wounding rather than killing right away, letting the condemned bleed out in the sand while the crowd roared approval. For the audience, this was thrilling. They were watching the ruler of Rome himself dispense life and death. For the victim, it was psychological torture of the highest order. Rome also experimented with creative ways to magnify fear. One of the most chilling methods involved mock rescues. A condemned man might be set up to believe he was about to be freed. The guards would cut his chains, hand him a wooden sword, and tell him he had earned his liberty. The gates of the arena would open, blinding sunlight streaming in, and for a few heartbeats the man would run toward what he thought was safety. Then, suddenly, a hidden trapdoor would open, or another gate would slam shut, and he would find himself surrounded by predators. The crowd loved this kind of drama. The sudden twist, the moment the victim realized his fate had been sealed all along. Psychological torment wasn't just aimed at individuals, but also at families. Parents and children might be executed together, but never at the same time. The Romans deliberately forced the survivors to watch, increasing the suffering. The order of deaths was chosen carefully. Often the father was made to watch his children die first, as the ultimate act of humiliation and despair. There are records of mothers screaming for the executioners to kill them before their children, only to be denied until the very end. Even the animals played a part in this mental warfare. Before the main event, victims were sometimes kept near the arena in holding pens, where they could hear the roars of lions and the cheers of the crowd. They could smell the blood and see the sand being raked clean from previous killings. By the time they were brought into the arena, many were already broken, pale, shaking, unable to walk without help. The Romans liked this. It made the spectacle more dramatic. But perhaps the cruelest element of all was the public participation. The crowd wasn't just watching, they were deciding. A popular myth tells of thumbs being turned up or down to signal life or death. The exact gesture is debated by historians, but the truth is that the people often did have influence. A prisoner's survival could depend on how well he entertained, how bravely he faced death, even on how beautiful his final words were. A coward's plea might seal his fate. A bold joke might buy him a chance to fight again another day. It turned death into theater, with the crowd as both jury and executioner, and when mercy did come, it was rarely kindness. A reprieve might mean the victim would fight again, prolonging his suffering for another day, entertainment. Some men lived for months this way, enduring fight after fight, mauling after mauling, never knowing which day would be their last. The Colosseum was a machine that turned human suffering into spectacle. It didn't just kill, it broke people body and soul in front of an audience. And Rome loved it. The more creative the cruelty, the more memorable the show, the more the empire's power was reinforced. The damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was perhaps the most terrifying punishment the Colosseum had to offer. It was more than just an execution. It was a ritual, a public demonstration that Rome controlled not only its criminals, but the very forces of nature. The condemned were thrown into the arena with lions, leopards, bears, and even crocodiles, many of which had been starved for days to ensure maximum aggression. The cruelty was deliberate and slow. Prisoners were often unarmed, stripped naked, and tied to posts or left in the open sand. The first moments were agony. The beasts would circle, sniffing, sometimes swiping lazily, as if toying with their prey. The entire Colosseum held its breath, waiting for the first scream. When the attack finally came, it was explosive. A lion leaping from the shadows, jaws locking around a man's throat, dragging him down as the crowd erupted into frenzied cheers. But it wasn't always quick. Some punishments were staged with precision, designed to echo famous myths. A condemned man might be dressed as Orpheus, serenading the wild animals with a lyre until they tore him apart. Another might play Actaeon, the hunter cursed to be devoured by his own hounds. The Romans loved this macabre theatre, death as a form of living art, turning human suffering into a lesson drawn from legend. There are chilling accounts of elephants being used in executions, trampling men to death under their massive feet, sometimes even tearing them apart with their trunks. Crocodiles were brought in from Egypt, causing panic as they slithered through the sand. Once, it is said, a rhinoceros was unleashed on a group of criminals, not to kill them quickly, but to terrify them, charging again and again until the victims collapsed from exhaustion. Sometimes the condemned were given weapons, not as mercy, but as part of the entertainment. A man might be forced to fight a wild boar with nothing but a wooden spear. If he survived, the crowd might cheer for his skill, before sending in a bigger, deadlier animal. The point was not victory, it was fear, blood, and spectacle. And the violence didn't stop when the beasts were done. Surviving prisoners could be dragged away, their wounds hastily patched up so they could face another execution the next day. The Colosseum was relentless. It consumed people until there was nothing left. Even the animals suffered. Lions and panthers were killed by the hundreds, sometimes just for sport. Rome's hunger for blood was insatiable, and the more exotic the creature, the more it delighted the masses. Ships were sent across Africa and Asia to capture beasts for the games, creating an empire-wide machine of death that fed the Colosseum's appetite. And yet, through all of this, the crowd never lost its taste for the spectacle. The screams, the roars, the clash of steel and bone. It was the soundtrack of Roman power. The emperors knew this. They used the arena to remind everyone who ruled Rome, who controlled life and death. The Colosseum wasn't just entertainment. It was a warning: defy the empire and this is what will happen to you. As if the beasts were not enough, the Colosseum saved some of its most ghastly punishments for those it wanted to humiliate in the most spectacular way possible. Crucifixion, the execution method reserved for the lowest of the low, was sometimes performed inside the arena itself. The condemned were nailed or tied to wooden crosses planted in the sand, forming a grim forest of human suffering. The victims would hang for hours, sometimes days, until thirst, exhaustion, or the birds circling above finally finished them. The Roman audience, accustomed to suffering, watched in eerie fascination. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders, pointing as the dying moaned and writhed in the sun. Sometimes to speed things along or intensify the spectacle, the executioners would set fire to the crosses, turning the condemned into living torches. The smell of burning flesh mingled with the sweat and dust of the arena, leaving no one untouched by the horror. Other times, prisoners were burned alive in carefully staged reenactments of myth. Say a man might be dressed as Hercules, forced to wear a tunic soaked in flammable pitch, then set ablaze, a living portrayal of the hero's tragic death. To the Roman mind, this wasn't just cruelty. It was theatre, a kind of justice where the victim's fate mirrored the stories Rome held sacred. There were even more elaborate forms of death. Stage crews would build massive wooden props, fake mountains, rivers, or temples, where the executions would take place. One historian describes a scene where criminals were forced to play the part of mythic lovers, chained together and devoured by wild animals, while the crowd laughed and cheered. The Colosseum was equipped with complex machinery to make these scenes even more dramatic. Trapdoors would open suddenly, releasing a bear or lion right under the feet of the condemned. Platforms could be hoisted high into the air, then dropped, breaking bones on impact. Water could even be flooded into the arena to create miniature naval battles, or to drown prisoners in a staged shipwreck. Sometimes execution became a slow ritual, designed to break the spirit as much as the body. A man might be forced to watch as his friends or family were killed first, their blood soaking the sand while he waited for his turn. Others were dragged behind chariots until they were nearly dead, then thrown before the beasts to finish the job. Even death did not always mean release. Bodies could be mutilated, displayed, or dragged around the arena to satisfy the crowd's morbid curiosity. Heads were sometimes placed on spikes at the edge of the arena, as a warning to any who might challenge Rome. It is said that even hardened gladiators, men used to bloodshed, sometimes refused to watch these punishments. The line between justice and spectacle had been erased. The Colosseum had become a machine designed not just to kill, but to crush the human spirit, to remind every person in the audience that the power of life and death belonged to Rome alone. As the centuries passed, the endless slaughter inside the Colosseum began to weigh even on Roman society. What had once been a symbol of Rome's glory became, for some, a grim mirror reflecting its cruelty. Philosophers like Seneca wrote about the corrosive effect of watching death as entertainment, warning that such spectacles hardened the heart and eroded compassion. But the games continued, for the crowd still came, still demanded blood. Roman emperors used the arena as a tool of control, reminding the masses that their ruler alone held the power over life and death. Free grain and free games, paneme circense, kept the people loyal, distracted from their poverty and the political intrigues of the Senate. Every drop of blood spilled into the sand became a message. Rome is strong. Rome is eternal. Rome cannot be defied. But even Rome's appetite for death had limits. As the empire shifted toward Christianity, the moral tide began to turn. Christian writers denounced the games as barbaric and sinful, a place where murder was celebrated and human dignity destroyed. Stories spread of Christians martyred in the arena, torn apart by lions for refusing to renounce their faith. Whether all of these stories are historically accurate or not, they fueled a growing revulsion. By the 5th century, as the empire weakened and its resources drained, the great spectacles dwindled. The costs of importing animals and prisoners became too high, and the empire had other wars to fight. In 404 CE, the last recorded gladiatorial combat was held in Rome. When the final victim fell and the arena grew silent, a chapter of history closed, but the memory of what had happened there would never fade. The Colosseum itself remains, scarred and broken, but still towering over the city. Its stones seem to hold the echoes of the screams, the roar of the crowd, the metallic stench of blood that once soaked its sand. It is both a monument to Roman engineering brilliance and a memorial to its capacity for cruelty. Even today, to stand inside the Colosseum is to feel its weight. The bright Italian sunlight casts long shadows across the tiers where tens of thousands once sat, demanding the death of men and women below. The underground tunnels still whisper of fear, of men clutching weapons and whispering prayers before being driven out to fight. Perhaps that is why the Colosseum continues to fascinate us, because it forces us to confront a part of human nature we would rather ignore. The people who filled those stands were not monsters. They were ordinary citizens, just like us. They laughed, they cheered, they gasped in horror, and they kept coming back for more. The Colosseum reminds us that civilization can sit side by side with savagery, that the very society capable of building aqueducts, roads, and laws was also capable of turning mass death into a public festival. And as long as we continue to be fascinated by it, perhaps we are not as far removed from those Roman crowds as we like to think.